Let us begin in the darkness. It is approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, in the year 1285, in a small town in the south of England. The sky outside the narrow window of a stone building is the color of wet slate, a featureless pre-dawn gray that offers no warmth and no light. The air is cold, not the refreshing cold of a crisp morning, but a deep, damp, penetrating cold that has seeped through the stone walls and settled into every surface, every blanket, every bone in every small body lying on the narrow wooden cots that line the dormitory of the cathedral school. A bell rings. It is not a gentle, melodious bell like the chime of a modern alarm clock that you can silence with a tap of your finger. It is a heavy iron bell mounted in the tower above the dormitory, and it is struck by a rope pulled by a monk whose only job at this hour is to ensure that no one sleeps a moment longer than the rule allows. Clang, clang, clang. The sound is brutal, metallic, and absolute. It enters the dormitory like a physical force, bouncing off the stone walls and the low ceiling, filling the room with a vibration that can be felt in the teeth. The boys rise. There are approximately 20 of them, ranging in age from 7 to 14. They sleep in their underclothes, a long linen shirt that reaches to the knees, because the dormitory is too cold for undressing and too dark for finding scattered garments. They swing their legs over the sides of their cots, their bare feet touching the stone floor, which is so cold that the contact produces an involuntary hiss of discomfort. They reach for their woolen tunics, which they left folded on the end of the bed the previous night, and pull them on with the hurried, fumbling movements of children who are half asleep and entirely unwilling to be awake. There is no washing. There is no brushing of teeth. There is no breakfast. The first activity of the day is prayer, and it begins in approximately 12 minutes in the cathedral next door, and the boys will walk there in a silent, single-file line through the cloister, across the cold flagstones, and into the choir stalls, where they will stand for the next hour, singing the psalms of the office of matins in a Latin that most of them barely understand. The walk to the cathedral is short, perhaps 50 yards, but it is conducted in absolute silence. The rule of the school forbids speaking before the first prayer of the day, and the rule is enforced by the magister, the schoolmaster, who walks behind the line of boys with a thin birch rod in his hand. The rod is approximately 3 feet long, supple and light. It makes a faint whistling sound when it is swung through the air. Fwish. This sound is, for the boys of the cathedral school, the most familiar and the most feared sound in their daily existence. It means that someone has broken a rule, and that pain is about to follow. The boys enter the cathedral through a small side door that leads directly into the choir. The cathedral is vast, dark, and cold, colder somehow than the dormitory, because the stone is thicker and the space is larger, and the heat of 20 small bodies is lost in the immensity of the nave. The candles on the altar provide a faint, flickering light that illuminates the faces of the carved saints in the reredos, but does nothing to warm the air. The boys take their places in the choir stalls, 2 rows of carved wooden seats facing each other across the central aisle, and the service begins. The singing of matins is the first test of the day. The psalms are in Latin, and they are sung to plain-chant melodies that the boys have memorized through endless repetition. The melodies are simple, repetitive, and hauntingly beautiful. Long, flowing lines of music that rise and fall in gentle, wave-like patterns. The boys' voices, high and clear in the cold air, blend together in a sound that is both ancient and ethereal. A sound that has been heard in this cathedral at this hour every morning for hundreds of years. But the beauty of the sound is not what the boys are thinking about. They are thinking about the cold. Their fingers are stiff. Their feet are numb. Their breath produces small white clouds that drift upward in the candlelight. They are thinking about the fact that they have been standing for 45 minutes and their legs ache, and the wooden edge of the choir stall is pressing into the backs of their knees. And they are thinking about the magister who stands at the end of the row, his birch rod resting against his thigh, his eyes moving slowly across the line of boys, watching for the slightest sign of inattention. A boy yawns. It is a small yawn, barely visible, quickly suppressed by a hand pressed against the mouth. But the magister sees it. He always sees it. He moves down the row with a quiet, deliberate step, his leather shoes making a soft tick-tick-tick on the stone floor. And he delivers a single sharp tap to the boy's knuckles with the birch rod. Thwack. The sound echoes in the vaulted space. The boy flinches but does not cry out, because crying out would earn a second stroke. He continues to sing, his eyes watering, his knuckles turning red, the Latin syllables continuing to flow from his lips as if nothing has happened. Matins ends. The boys file out of the cathedral in the same silent line and return to the school building. The sky has lightened slightly from slate gray to a pale, milky white, but the sun is still below the horizon. The air smells of damp stone, wood smoke, and the faint waxy scent of the extinguished candles. The boys' feet are so cold that they can barely feel the flagstones beneath them. Now comes breakfast, such as it is. The boys sit at a long wooden table in the refectory, a narrow, low-ceilinged room with a single fireplace at one end that gives off more smoke than heat. Each boy receives a piece of bread, dark, dense, maslin bread, the same bread that every peasant in England is eating this morning, and a cup of thin ale. The bread is hard, not stale hard, but structurally hard, the kind of bread that resists the teeth and requires sustained, vigorous chewing. The ale is weak, cloudy, and lukewarm. The boys eat in silence because the rule requires silence during meals, and the magister sits at the head of the table with his rod across his knees. The eating takes approximately 10 minutes. There is no second helping. There is no variation. The bread and ale of Monday are identical to the bread and ale of Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Thursday, and every other day of the school year, with the exception of feast days, when the boys might receive a piece of cheese or a small portion of salt fish as a treat. The concept of a varied diet, of food as a source of pleasure or interest, does not exist within the walls of the cathedral school. Food is fuel, and it is dispensed in the minimum quantity necessary to keep the boys alive and functional. After breakfast, the school day begins. The boys walk from the refectory to the schoolroom, another stone-walled, stone-floored room slightly larger than the dormitory, with a single window of oiled parchment that admits a dim, yellowish light. The room contains no desks, no chairs, no blackboard, and no books, at least no books in the hands of the students. The only book in the room belongs to the magister, and it is a heavy, leather-bound manuscript of the Psalter, chained to a wooden lectern at the front of the room. The boys sit on the floor, not on cushions, not on mats, not on anything that might provide comfort or insulation from the cold stone. They sit cross-legged, their backs straight, their hands in their laps, their eyes fixed on the magister, who stands at the lectern with his book open before him and his birch rod within arm's reach. The first lesson of the day is Latin. Not conversational Latin, not practical Latin, not the kind of Latin that you might use to buy a loaf of bread in a Roman market. This is grammatical Latin, the formal technical study of Latin grammar as codified in the 4th century textbook of Aelius Donatus, a work known simply as the Donatus, which has been the standard Latin grammar textbook for the past 900 years. The Donatus is not a book designed to spark joy. It is a systematic, exhaustive, mercilessly thorough catalogue of every noun declension, every verb conjugation, every pronoun form, every adverb, and every syntactic rule of the Latin language. It is organized not by theme or by practical application, but by grammatical category, and it proceeds through these categories with the relentless, grinding patience of a millstone turning through grain. The magister reads a passage from the Donatus. His voice is a flat, measured monotone, the voice of a man who has read these same passages every morning for the past 20 years and has long since ceased to find them interesting. He reads the first declension of nouns: Musa, Musai, Musai, Musam, Musa, Musa, Muse, Musarum, Musis, Musas, Muse, Musis. The words are Latin for muse, but there is nothing muse-like about the way they are taught. They are a sequence of syllables, a pattern of endings, a structure to be memorized with the same mechanical precision that a modern child memorizes the multiplication tables. The boys repeat after the magister in unison: Musa, Musai, Musai, Musam, Musa, Musa. Their voices are flat, tired, and slightly sullen, the voices of children who have been awake since 5 o'clock and have eaten nothing but hard bread and weak ale. The repetition continues: Musai, Musarum, Muses, Musas, Musai, Muses. Again, and again, and again. The same 6 forms, in the same order, repeated 10, 15, 20 times, until the pattern is embedded in the memory, not through understanding, but through sheer, numbing repetition. This method of teaching, repetition, recitation, memorization, was the foundation of medieval education. There was no explanation of why the endings changed, no discussion of how the grammar related to the meaning, no attempt to connect the abstract patterns to the living, breathing language that had once been spoken in the forums of Rome. The grammar was simply to be learned, the way one learns the steps of a dance or the notes of a melody, by doing it again and again until the body knows the pattern even when the mind has ceased to pay attention. The Latin lesson continues for approximately 2 hours. During this time, the boys progress from the first declension to the second, and from the second to the third. Each declension is read by the magister, repeated by the boys, and then tested. The magister points to a boy at random and demands a specific form. Dominus, genitive plural. The boy must answer immediately, without hesitation, without consulting a book, without any aid but his own memory. Dominorum, he says, and if he is correct, the magister moves on to the next boy. If he is wrong, the birch rod descends. Thwack. The sound of the rod hitting the open palm of a boy's hand is a sharp, cracking report that makes every other boy in the room flinch. The boy who has been struck cradles his hand against his chest, his face reddening, his eyes blinking rapidly. He does not cry. He learned long ago that crying earns a second stroke. He sits back down, his hand throbbing, his mind racing through the declension that he will be asked again before the hour is over, because the magister always returns to the boy who got it wrong. And if the answer is wrong a second time, the punishment is doubled. The fear of the birch rod is the primary motivator of medieval education. It is not an occasional punishment reserved for serious infractions. It is a constant, ambient presence, a tool of instruction that is used as readily and as casually as a modern teacher uses a whiteboard marker. A boy who fails to memorize his lesson is struck. A boy who speaks out of turn is struck. A boy who fidgets, yawns, looks out the window, scratches his nose, or allows his attention to wander for even a moment is struck. The rod is the grammar of the grammar school, the underlying structure upon which every lesson, every recitation, and every moment of the school day is built. By the end of the Latin lesson, the boys' palms are pink. Their attention is sharply focused, and the declensions of the first three nouns are lodged in their memories with the permanent, unshakable solidity of fear-reinforced learning. They will remember these forms for the rest of their lives, not because they wanted to learn them, and not because they understood them, but because the alternative to remembering was pain. After the Latin lesson, there is a brief interval. The boys are allowed to stand, to stretch their legs, and to visit the latrine, a small, cold, foul-smelling room behind the school building that consists of a wooden bench with a hole over a cesspit. They visit in pairs because the rule forbids a boy from being alone. The magister and the church are deeply suspicious of what a boy might do if left unsupervised, even for the 2 minutes it takes to use a latrine. The wooden seat is cold, the smell is powerful, the visit is brief. The second lesson of the morning is the Psalter. The Book of Psalms is the heart of the medieval school curriculum, not because of its literary beauty or its theological depth, though it possesses both, but because the Psalms are the texts that the boys will be required to sing in the cathedral choir for the rest of their ecclesiastical careers. A boy who cannot recite the Psalms from memory cannot function as a member of the clergy, and the purpose of the cathedral school is, above all else, to produce members of the clergy. The learning of the Psalms proceeds by the same method as the learning of Latin grammar: repetition. The magister reads a verse. The boys repeat it. The magister reads the next verse. The boys repeat it. The verses accumulate one by one, like bricks being laid in a wall, each one resting on the one beneath it, each one requiring the same effort, the same attention, the same mind-numbing, soul-crushing repetition. Beatus vir qui non abiet in concilio impiorum. The magister reads, Beatus vir qui non abiet in concilio impiorum. The boys repeat. Their voices are flat. Their eyes are glazed. The Latin words flow through their mouths like water through a pipe, entering at one end and exiting at the other, without touching the sides. They do not know, most of them, what the words mean. They know only that the words must be memorized, and that failure to memorize them will result in the birch rod, and that the birch rod hurts, and that therefore the words will be memorized. The Psalter lesson continues for another 2 hours. By its end, the boys have memorized approximately 10 new verses, adding them to the hundreds of verses that they have already committed to memory over the preceding months and years. a fully trained choir boy was expected to know all 150 psalms by heart, a total of approximately 2,500 verses in a language he did not speak, set to melodies he had learned by ear, in a building where the temperature rarely rose above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It is now approximately 11 o'clock in the morning. The boys have been awake for 6 hours. They have sung matins, eaten a small breakfast of bread and ale, sat on a cold stone floor for 4 hours of instruction, memorized Latin declensions and psalm verses, and received an undetermined number of blows from the birch rod. They are hungry, tired, cold, and sore, and the day is not yet half over. The midday meal is served in the refectory. It is the main meal of the day, and it is, by the standards of the cathedral school, relatively generous. Each boy receives a bowl of pottage, the same thick, bland, barley-based stew that every household in medieval England eats at every meal, a piece of bread and a cup of ale. On certain days, the pottage contains a small piece of salt fish or a fragment of cheese. On fast days, which account for approximately half the days of the year, the pottage contains only vegetables and grain. The boys eat in silence, listening to one of their number read aloud from a devotional text, his thin voice echoing in the low-ceilinged room, while the others chew their bread and stare at their bowls. After the midday meal, there is a brief period of recreation. The word recreation should not be confused with its modern meaning. Medieval recreation does not involve sports, games, playgrounds, or anything that a modern child would recognize as fun. It is a period of approximately 30 minutes during which the boys are allowed to walk in the cloister, the enclosed roofed walkway that surrounds the cathedral's central garden, and to talk among themselves quietly in pairs. The cloister is a beautiful space, a covered arcade of carved stone arches that frames a square of green grass with a fountain at its center. The fountain makes a soft, continuous splashing sound, splash, 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 that fills the cloister with a gentle, rhythmic background noise. The grass is damp with the morning's dew, and the air smells of wet stone and cut herbs from the small garden that the monks maintain in one corner. Pigeons coo on the roof above. The boys walk in slow circles around the arcade, their voices low, their conversation limited, because even during recreation, the rule forbids shouting, running, fighting, or any behavior that might be described as boisterous. The afternoon lessons begin at approximately 1 o'clock and continue until 4. The subject is writing, not creative writing, not essay writing, not any form of writing that involves the expression of personal thought or opinion. Writing in the medieval school means penmanship, the physical act of forming letters on a surface with a stylus or a quill. The youngest boys practice on wax tablets, flat rectangular boards of wood, approximately the size of a modern paperback book, coated with a thin layer of beeswax. The letters are scratched into the wax with a pointed metal stylus, and when the tablet is full, the wax is smoothed over with the flat end of the stylus, erasing the letters and providing a fresh surface. The tablet can be used and reused hundreds of times, a significant advantage in a world where parchment is expensive and paper does not yet exist in Western Europe. The sound of 20 boys scratching their styluses into wax is a soft, continuous whispering sound. Scritch, 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 scritch. It is the sound of concentrated effort, of small hands gripping metal tools, of young eyes squinting in the dim light of the schoolroom, trying to reproduce the precise, uniform letter forms that the magister has demonstrated on the large wax tablet at the front of the room. The letter forms are specific and unforgiving. Each letter must be shaped according to the standard script of the period, a style of handwriting called Caroline minuscule, which is characterized by clear, rounded letters with consistent proportions and even spacing. The modern reader would find Caroline minuscule remarkably legible. It is, in fact, the ancestor of the lowercase letters that we use today. But for a 7-year-old boy with cold fingers and a blunt stylus, reproducing its smooth curves and even proportions on a small wax tablet is a task of considerable difficulty. The magister walks among the boys, inspecting their tablets. He bends down, his face close to the wax, his eyes narrowed. "The tail of the G is too short," he says. "The bowl of the D is uneven. The ascender of the B leans to the left. Do it again." The boy smooths the wax, takes a breath, and begins again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The letter appears, slightly better this time, but still not perfect. "Again," says the magister. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Again. The older boys, who have graduated from the wax tablet, practice on parchment with quill pens. The quill is a goose feather cut to a precise point with a small, sharp knife called a penknife, the origin of the modern word. The cutting of the quill is itself a skill that takes weeks to learn. The feather must be trimmed, the tip must be split, and the nib must be shaped to produce a line that is thin on the upstroke and thick on the downstroke. A poorly cut quill will splatter ink, skip across the parchment, or produce a line of uneven thickness that the magister will reject instantly. The ink is made from oak galls, hard round growths found on oak trees, caused by the larvae of a parasitic wasp. The galls are crushed, soaked in water, and mixed with iron sulfate and gum arabic to produce a dark, brownish-black liquid that is stored in a small horn inkwell. The smell of the ink is sharp, metallic, and slightly astringent. The smell of iron and tannin, and the faint, woody scent of the crushed gall. The boy dips his quill into the ink. The tip of the quill breaks the surface of the liquid with a faint, almost inaudible tick. He lifts the quill, allowing the excess ink to drip back into the well. Drip, drip, and then brings the nib to the parchment. The first stroke is a downward pull, made with a steady, controlled pressure. The ink flows from the nib in a smooth, dark line that glistens wet for a moment before beginning to dry. The sound of the quill on parchment is a soft, scratching whisper, quieter than the stylus on wax, but somehow more intimate, more precise, more deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The boy forms his letters one at a time, each one a small act of concentrated effort. The quill moves slowly, much more slowly than a modern pen, because the flexible nib requires careful control. Too much pressure and the nib will splay apart, producing a blob of ink. Too little pressure and the ink will not flow, leaving a pale, scratchy line. The boy's hand moves with the tense, trembling care of a person diffusing a very small, very fragile bomb. A mistake is catastrophic. Parchment cannot be erased the way wax can be smoothed. An error must be scraped off with the penknife, a delicate operation that removes the top layer of the parchment surface and leaves a rough, fibrous patch that absorbs ink differently from the surrounding area. A page with too many scrapes is ruined, and parchment is expensive. A boy who wastes parchment through carelessness can expect to receive not merely a stroke of the birch rod, but a formal punishment, a beating that is administered in front of the entire school to serve as a warning to the others. The writing lesson continues until 4 o'clock, by which time the light from the oiled parchment window has dimmed to a barely functional glow. The boys' fingers are stiff from gripping the stylus or the quill. Their backs ache from hunching over their tablets and their parchment sheets. Their eyes are tired from the strain of forming tiny letters in inadequate light. They are, in every sense, exhausted. But the day is not over. At 4 o'clock, the bell rings again. Clang, 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 and the boys file back into the cathedral for the afternoon service. Vespers. This is a shorter service than matins, approximately 30 minutes, but it requires the same standing, the same singing, the same perfect, error-free recitation of the Psalms in the freezing air of the unheated choir. The magister stands in his usual position, his rod in his hand, his eyes scanning the rows for any sign of fatigue or inattention. The singing of Vespers at the end of a long school day has a particular quality. The boys' voices, which were bright and clear in the early morning, have become softer, slightly hoarse from the hours of recitation. The plainchant melodies, which were demanding at dawn, are now almost soothing, their gentle wave-like contours matching the exhaustion of the boys' bodies and the dimming of the winter light. The cathedral is even colder now than it was in the morning, and the candles on the altar cast long, flickering shadows across the stone floor that stretch and sway in the draughts. The sound of 20 boys singing plain chant in a cold cathedral at the end of a winter afternoon is one of the most beautiful and one of the most melancholy sounds in all of medieval culture. It is the sound of childhood being converted into utility, of small voices being shaped through repetition and discipline and the birch rod into instruments of worship. It is the sound of a system that valued learning but not enjoyment, that prized knowledge but not curiosity, that trained the mind but did not trouble itself with the happiness of the child who housed it. After Vespers, the boys returned to the refectory for the evening meal. This is the smallest meal of the day, a piece of bread and a cup of ale, nothing more. The bread is the same bread that was served at breakfast and at the midday meal, the same dark, dense, hard-chewing muslin loaf that accompanies every meal, every day, every week, every month of the school year. The boys eat in silence. The magister sits at the head of the table. The fire in the fireplace has burned low, and the room is cold, and the shadows are deep, and the silence is broken only by the sound of chewing and the occasional distant tolling of a bell from somewhere in the cathedral. After the evening meal, there is a final period of study. This is the boys' opportunity to review the lessons of the day, to recite the declensions they have memorized, to mouth the psalm verses silently, to practice their letter forms on the wax tablets by the light of a single tallow candle that sits on the table between every two boys. The candle gives off a dim, yellowish light and a faint, waxy smell. Its flame is small and steady, barely enough to illuminate the surface of the tablet, let alone the room. The boys' faces, bent over their work, are half in shadow, half in the warm, amber glow of the candlelight. The sound of this evening study is the sound of whispered Latin. The boys mouth the words under their breath. their lips moving silently or nearly silently, the syllables blending into a low, continuous murmur that fills the room like the buzzing of very small, very tired bees. Musa, musai, musai, musam. Beatus vir qui non habit. The words overlap, interweave, merge into a single, undifferentiated hum of memorization that has no beginning, no end, and no discernible meaning to anyone who is not participating in it. The candles burn lower. The shadows grow. The boys' heads begin to droop. One by one, their eyelids grow heavy, their lips stop moving, and their small bodies sag forward over their tablets. The magister, who has been sitting at the end of the table with a book of his own, looks up and sees that the battle is lost. He closes his book, stands, and gives the signal for the end of the day. The boys file out of the study room and back to the dormitory. The dormitory is cold. It is always cold. But their beds are waiting, and the woolen blankets, though thin, are at least familiar. The boys remove their outer tunics, fold them at the foot of their cots, and lie down in their linen undershirts. The magister walks the length of the dormitory, checking that each boy is in his bed, and then extinguishes the single oil lamp that has been burning in the corner. The room plunges into the same total, absolute darkness that greeted the boys at 5 o'clock that morning. The silence that follows is not quite silence. It is filled with the small, intimate sounds of 20 boys settling into sleep. The rustling of blankets being pulled up to chins, the creaking of wooden cots adjusting to the weight of small bodies, the soft, rhythmic breathing of children who are so tired that sleep comes not gradually but all at once, like a wave breaking over a sea wall. And somewhere in the darkness, a boy is whispering. He is whispering the declensions that he failed to answer correctly that morning, the ones that earned him a stroke of the birch rod, the ones that he will be asked again tomorrow. Dominus, Domini, Domino, Dominum, Domine, Domino, Domini, Dominorum, Dominis, Dominos, Domini, Dominis. The words are barely audible, a faint, breathy murmur that is swallowed by the darkness almost as soon as it leaves his lips. But the words are there, and they are correct. And they will be correct tomorrow, because the boy has learned them the only way the medieval school knew how to teach them, through repetition, through discipline, through the steady, relentless application of effort over time. The wind blows outside the dormitory window. It is a cold wind, carrying the smell of rain from the west, and it presses against the stone walls with a low, moaning sound. Hoo, hoo. The cathedral clock strikes 9. 9 deep, resonant chimes that roll across the sleeping town and fade into the darkness of the countryside beyond. The boys sleep. The magister sleeps. The cathedral stands in the darkness, its tower a black silhouette against the slightly less black sky, its bells silent, its choir stalls empty, waiting for the morning. And now let us step back from this single day and consider the broader picture, the shape of a medieval school year, the arc of a medieval education, the slow, grinding, transformative process by which a 7-year-old boy who could neither read nor write nor speak a word of Latin was converted over the course of 6 or 7 years into a literate, Latinate, musically trained member of the medieval clergy. The school year ran from approximately September to July, with breaks for the major feast days of the church calendar: Christmas, Easter, and the feast of the patron saint of the cathedral. These breaks were not holidays in the modern sense. They were liturgical observances, and they were often spent in the cathedral itself, participating in the elaborate services that marked these occasions. A boy might be excused from his lessons during Christmas week, but he would spend that week singing in the choir, processing through the cathedral, and standing for hours in the cold stone nave while the bishop delivered his sermon. The curriculum, such as it was, consisted of 3 subjects: Latin grammar, the Psalter, and music. There was no mathematics, no science, no history, no geography, and no physical education. The medieval school existed for a single purpose: to train boys for the church. And its curriculum reflected this purpose with a narrow, undeviating focus that left no room for curiosity, for exploration, or for the kind of broad, general education that a modern school aspires to provide. Latin grammar was the foundation. Without Latin, a boy could not read the Bible, could not participate in the liturgy, could not understand the law, and could not communicate with educated people in other countries. Latin was not merely a subject, it was the language of power, of knowledge, and of God. A boy who mastered Latin had access to every book, every legal document, every philosophical treatise, and every theological argument that the Western world had produced. A boy who failed to master Latin had access to nothing. The teaching of Latin grammar followed the same method year after year. The magister read, the boys repeated, the declensions were drilled, the conjugations were memorized, and the birch rod punished every failure. There was no conversation in Latin, no creative composition, no discussion of Latin literature. There was only grammar, the dry, mechanical skeleton of the language, stripped of its flesh and its beauty and its capacity for expression. A boy could spend 5 years studying Latin grammar and emerge knowing every rule, every exception, and every irregular verb, without ever having read a sentence of Cicero, Virgil, or any other author who demonstrated what the language could actually do. The Psalter was the second pillar of the curriculum. The 150 Psalms were memorized in their entirety, a task that typically required 2 to 3 years of daily repetition. The boys did not study the Psalms for their meaning. They did not discuss the theological content, the poetic imagery, or the historical context. They memorized the words, the Latin words, in the correct order with the correct pronunciation, because the words had to be known perfectly for the singing of the daily office. A mistake in the choir was a public failure, visible and audible to the entire congregation, and it reflected not only on the boy, but on the magister, the school, and the cathedral itself. Music, the singing of plain chant, was learned entirely by ear. There was no musical notation in the form that we would recognize today. The earliest systems of notation were being developed during this period, but they were available only in the most advanced monastic scriptoria, not in the ordinary cathedral school. The boys learned the melodies by listening to the magister sing each phrase and repeating it until the melody was embedded in their memory. The process was slow, painstaking, and entirely dependent on the accuracy of the magister's own singing. A magister who sang a melody incorrectly would transmit his error to an entire generation of choir boys, who would in turn transmit it to the next generation, and so on, in a chain of accumulated inaccuracy that could persist for decades. The boys sang every day, at matins, at vespers, and at any other service that the cathedral calendar required. The The singing was not optional, not voluntary, not a matter of personal interest or talent. Every boy sang, regardless of his ability, because the choir needed bodies and the office needed voices. A boy with a beautiful voice was valued. A boy with a terrible voice was tolerated. Both were expected to perform their duty day after day, year after year, with the same patient, uncomplaining endurance that characterized every other aspect of medieval life. The discipline of the school was severe, constant, and entirely accepted. The birch rod was not considered cruel or unusual. It was considered normal, an essential tool of education endorsed by the church, approved by the parents, and expected by the boys themselves. The medieval world believed, with a conviction that was rooted in scripture and confirmed by centuries of practice, that learning required suffering. Spare the rod and spoil the child was not a proverb, it was a philosophy. The boy who was beaten learned his lessons. The boy who was not beaten did not. The logic was simple, brutal, and within its own terms, effective. The effectiveness of the system is undeniable. The cathedral schools of medieval England produced generations of literate, disciplined, highly trained clergy who could read, write, sing, and function in Latin with a fluency that is difficult to match in a modern educational context. These men, and they were exclusively men because the cathedral school did not admit girls, went on to staff the churches, the courts, the chanceries, and the universities of medieval Europe. They copied manuscripts, kept records, administered justice, and preserved the intellectual heritage of the classical world through the long centuries of the Middle Ages. But the cost of this effectiveness was high. The boys who entered the cathedral school at the age of 7 emerged at the age of 13 or 14 with a thorough knowledge of Latin grammar, a complete memorization of the Psalter, and a solid ability to read, write, and sing. They also emerged with, in many cases, a deep and lasting aversion to learning itself, an association between education and pain that colored their relationship with books, with knowledge, and with the life of the mind for the rest of their lives. The great irony of the medieval school is that it produced scholars who hated scholarship, readers who dreaded reading, and singers who associated music with cold, hunger, and the whistling sound of a birch rod descending toward an open palm. The system worked, in the narrow sense that it achieved its goal of producing functional clergy. But it worked at a cost that is invisible in the historical record, a cost measured not in money or in time, but in the quiet, unmeasurable damage done to the spirits of thousands of small boys who learned their Latin in the dark, on empty stomachs, in rooms of cold stone. There is one more aspect of the medieval school that deserves our slow, patient attention, and that is the matter of books. Or more precisely, the almost complete absence of books. In the year 1285, a book was not an object that you could buy in a shop, borrow from a library, or receive as a gift from a well-meaning relative. A book was a treasure, a hand-copied, hand-bound, hand-illustrated object that represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor and a small fortune in materials. The parchment alone was expensive. Parchment was made from the skin of a sheep or a calf, scraped, stretched, dried, and smoothed until it was thin enough to write on. A single sheet of parchment required the skin of one animal. A complete Bible might require the skins of 200 sheep. The cost was enormous, and the supply was limited by the number of animals available. and the number of skilled parchment makers in the region. The copying of the text was performed by hand, by a scribe working in a scriptorium, a dedicated writing room, usually within a monastery, where rows of monks sat at angled desks, their quills scratching against the parchment in a steady, rhythmic whisper. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Each letter was formed individually. Each word was checked against the exemplar. Each page was inspected for errors before the next was begun. A skilled scribe could copy approximately 2 to 3 pages per day. A complete Bible might take a single scribe more than a year of continuous labor. The illumination, the decoration of the text with colored inks, gold leaf, and elaborate border designs added further time and further cost. The colors were made from mineral pigments, blue from lapis lazuli, red from cinnabar, green from malachite, each one ground by hand in a small mortar and mixed with egg white to create a smooth, brilliant paint. The gold leaf was applied in tiny, individual sheets, pressed onto the page with a burnishing tool that left the gold smooth and gleaming. The result was a page of extraordinary beauty, a work of art that was also a tool of worship. But the time required to produce it was measured in weeks, not hours. Given all of this, the cathedral school possessed very few books. The Magister's Psalter was the primary text, and it was shared among the entire student body. There were perhaps 1 or 2 other volumes, a copy of the Donatus, a hymnal, possibly a copy of the Distichs of Cato, a collection of moral proverbs in Latin that was used as a reading primer,